The day I became the most despised resident of Willow Glen Reserve was also the day I took complete control of it. $500, that's what Deborah Langston and her HOA cronies charged me for fishing on my own lake, alongside my daughter, who was still grieving her mother's tragic death from leukemia. What Deborah didn't realize was that I had hundreds of thousands of reasons to strike back and enough determination to make sure she regretted ever knocking on my door. If you're watching this right now, hiding from your own HOA's ridiculous rules, leave a comment telling me your story. My name is Darren Whitaker. Before all of this, I was just a man trying to rebuild what was left of my life. After years as a financial consultant in Washington, D.C., I had to leave everything behind when my wife, Lena, got sick. The diagnosis was devastating. Aggressive leukemia, advanced stage. It was 11 weeks of hospital visits, back and forth, hope and pain, until the fight ended, and silence took over our home. I was left alone with Nyla, our 11-year-old daughter, whose eyes carried the same sadness I hid in my chest. In Lena's final days, the only thing we could still do together was fish. At the lake near the hospital, she felt alive, even when her body no longer responded. After she passed, I kept that ritual with Nyla as a way to keep Lena close. It was less about catching fish and more about finding peace in the memory. That's why I decided to start over far from the capital, far from memories that felt too concrete. I chose Willow Glen Reserve, a community surrounded by tall trees and a quiet lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. The house had a small wooden dock out back, exactly as Lena would have described in her dreams. It was the perfect setting for the healing I so desperately sought. There, I imagined Nyla might smile again. On a sunny Saturday morning, Nyla sat beside me, her legs swinging over the lake, her hands steady on the fishing rod. For the first time in a long while, she seemed light. A small fish tugged at the line, and she laughed as if the sound of the water had brought back a forgotten piece of her childhood. But the moment didn't last. Firm footsteps approached from behind, and a shadow fell over us. A blonde woman in expensive athletic wear, holding a tablet, stared at us like we were intruders. Her cold eyes scanned our tackle box, as if it were a dangerous weapon. Without even introducing herself, she pointed at the lake and said in a sharp voice, "This is a violation of the rules. Fishing here is prohibited." I tried to explain that we'd moved in 2 months ago and had chosen the house specifically because of the lake. She wasn't moved. With the authority of someone used to going unquestioned, she announced that a new rule had been passed the previous month, banning fishing. She said the fine was $500 and that, as president of the HOA, she had already issued the citation. I tried to reason with her. I mentioned the real estate agent who assured us the lake was a selling point. I even showed her the listing brochure. Deborah Langston, her name, just smirked and said, "Ignorance is no excuse." Nyla didn't understand what was happening. She just gripped my hand tightly when she sensed I was getting tense. I saw a glint of satisfaction in Deborah's eyes as she handed me the fine. It wasn't about rules. She wanted us to know we weren't welcome there. It was as if our presence had violated something invisible and silent, an unwritten expectation about who belonged in that neighborhood. I took the fine in silence, but every word on that paper burned like an insult. Nyla asked why we were being punished. I didn't know how to answer right away. I looked at the lake and thought of Lena, the strength she carried even in her final moments. This woman, this fine, this rule. It wasn't just about fishing. It was about erasing memories, silencing voices, closing doors. When we went back inside the house, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more rational. Deborah had touched the one part of my life I still protected with tenderness, and that gave me clarity. She might not have known it, but in that moment, by fining us in front of the lake we'd chosen as our refuge, she didn't just wake me up. She gave me a purpose. That morning wasn't just the end of a fishing trip. It was the start of an inevitable confrontation. Not just for me, not just for Nyla, but for everyone who had been silenced in that community where smiles were forced and rules hid agendas. And as I tore up the citation and looked at the calm waters, I knew the real fight was just beginning. The leukemia that took Lena from our lives wasn't a long war. It was a swift, cruel, and devastating blow. In less than 3 months, she went from healthy to frail, and then gone. In the days when she could still smile, there was only one moment of peace. Sitting by the lake's edge, the sun setting slowly, the silence broken only by the sound of the water and the line being reeled in. Fishing wasn't a hobby. It was an emotional anchor, a way to hold our entire world together for just a few more moments. After she passed, Nyla sank into a deep grief, silent, far too mature for an 11-year-old. I didn't know how to help her. But there was one thing that still worked: waking up early, grabbing the rods, and sitting on the dock. Sometimes we'd sit there without saying a word, not because of silence between us, but because the space between one fish and the next held memories that words could never capture. It was there that Lena still lived in our rituals. When it came time to start over, I made it a point to find a home that would preserve that connection. I wasn't just looking for a nice property. I was looking for a place of healing. When I found the house in Willow Glen Reserve, with the lake out back, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of birds at sunrise, I knew it was the one. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses spaced out enough to ensure privacy, and the lake seemed untouched, as if it were waiting for our story. Our mornings were always the same, and that's what made them so precious. I'd make coffee, and Nyla would already be ready with her mom's favorite cap and her rod in hand. The breeze brushed lightly against our faces. The leaves danced in the wind, and every movement of the hook was an attempt to bring Lena back, even if just in memory. When Nyla smiled, I saw traces of her mother in her eyes. It was as if time stopped just for the two of us. The $500 fine we received wasn't just a penalty, it was an emotional invasion. Deborah Langston didn't know what that lake meant. She didn't know what losing someone so brutally left behind. She didn't understand the silence of a grieving home or the importance of a simple ritual like fishing. She looked at us like a rule enforcer, not as two souls trying to rebuild. What hurt wasn't the amount itself, it was the coldness of the act, the lack of empathy, the inability to see a child smiling with a fish in her hands and find beauty in that moment. We were treated like offenders, like intruders on something that, deep down, was ours too. Deborah could have addressed it differently. She could have explained, or even listened, but she chose humiliation. Nyla didn't understand. She looked at me, confused, holding the fish she'd just pulled from the water. She asked quietly if we were doing something wrong. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say it was just a misunderstanding, but everything in me screamed against the injustice. That lake was our sanctuary, and now it was becoming the stage for yet another pain. It was inevitable. Something inside me broke in that moment. A silent snap that told me this story couldn't end like this, that it wasn't enough to swallow the hurt and move on, that sometimes grief demands more than silence and acceptance. It demands justice, and maybe, just maybe, the next morning at the lake wouldn't just bring fishing, but the start of a turning point. Deborah Langston introduced herself as the HOA president with a rehearsed, almost imperial formality. She wore designer athletic gear and flashed a smile that was more a thin line of arrogance. Her gaze didn't seek connection, it sought flaws. Every gesture was calculated, as if she were commanding an invisible boardroom. She didn't need to shout. Her authority was in the silence she imposed, and the entire community seemed to orbit around her, like satellites of convenience and fear. Over time, I learned she had been running the HOA for nearly a decade, and her influence went far beyond the monthly meetings. Behind decisions about garden decor and lawn height, there was a web of absolute control. Deborah also owned Langston Properties, a real estate company specializing in exclusive homes for traditional families. That's how she defined the neighborhood standard and who fit into it. Nothing about Deborah was accidental. Every meeting, every new rule, every fine issued followed a script only she knew. And there was a pattern. Families deemed outside the ideal were slowly suffocated. One day it was a warning about a mailbox, the next a summons for improper garage use. Until, worn down, they moved out. And soon after, the house would be bought by one of the many shell companies tied to her, always at below-market prices. Longtime residents feared her, but no one spoke openly. It was as if everyone knew but lacked the courage to confirm. Deborah smiled at community parties, sent praise-filled group emails, and organized events with hired photographers. But behind it all, she made families disappear from the neighborhood, discreetly, leaving no trace beyond sold signs in front of homes where resistance once stood. The fine I received for fishing with my daughter wasn't random. It was the first move in a game she had played before. Seeing us there, me, a widower, a new resident, with an 11-year-old black daughter, Deborah understood we didn't fit the picture she painted. And as she always did, she acted quickly. She didn't discuss. She just typed the fine into her tablet and moved on, as if she were removing something bothersome from the scene. In that moment, I realized it wasn't about fishing. It never was. It was about the kind of people she wanted in the community, about maintaining the appearance of an exclusive place, where all the houses were identical and all the residents convenient. But I wasn't someone who accepted being reduced to silence, especially when it came to my wife's memory and my daughter's emotional well-being. If she thought I'd back down, she was wrong. Deborah might dominate meetings, manipulate regulations, and control much of the neighborhood, but there was something she didn't anticipate. I also knew how to read contracts, follow trails, and understand the systems behind the curtains. And one thing was certain: if she wanted to turn the lake into a symbol of exclusion, I'd make that same lake the turning point. That same night, I opened a bottle of cheap wine, sat at the table with my laptop, and started digging through all the HOA's public documents. I expected to find contradictions. I didn't expect to stumble upon a monumental discovery. There, buried in a poorly scanned technical addendum, was the fact that the lake didn't officially belong to the Homeowners Association. The legal owner was the original developer, Summit Vista Development. And more, the HOA's usage contract was set to expire in exactly 46 days. My neighbor, Royce Adams, was the kind of man who hid decades of wisdom behind a well-kept garden. A retired environmental lawyer, he got straight to the point when I asked about Deborah. She's trying to buy the lake for herself. Royce had waged a quiet war with the HOA years earlier when they tried to ban him from planting native trees in his yard. Now he saw in me a new chance to fight back, with evidence, strategy, and precision. The revelation hit me like a bolt of lightning. While she was finding us for fishing, she was working behind the scenes to turn that lake into her private property, not the community's, hers. Royce showed me the reports from the latest assemblies, the requests for budget reviews, the closed-door meetings to discuss emergency funds. It was all there, disguised as bureaucracy, but the plan was clear: raise money from residents and transfer the lake to Langston Properties through an obscure contract. Worse still, this wasn't new. Royce told me about a community park on the other side of the neighborhood that had disappeared from the map after a change in documents. The park turned into 3 luxury homes, sold by companies that, it was later discovered, had partners in common with Deborah. Now, history was repeating itself, but there was a difference. This time, she messed with the pain of a father who just wanted a corner of peace for his daughter. With every paper I read, my indignation grew. The lake was the emotional heart of that place. It was the reflection of healing mornings with Nyla, and they were about to rip it away, turning my wife's memory into another showcase of exclusivity for wealthy buyers. This couldn't just be a personal battle, it was a crusade for justice. And I knew that with the right allies, I could turn the tables before she delivered her checkmate. Royce looked me in the eye as we flipped through the papers on his patio, lit by yellow lights and surrounded by ferns. If you want to take on this woman, you need to play her game, but better. I took a deep breath. I had a background in finance. I knew how to spot loopholes. If she wanted to weaponize the lake, I'd turn it into a shield, and maybe, if we played it right, a trap. Royce introduced me to Clarence Monroe, a man with a firm voice, a light linen suit, and the look of someone who had seen too much. A former banker and self-taught statistician, he had turned his pain into charts. For the past 5 years, he'd been quietly collecting every citation, fine, and warning issued by the HOA. In his basement-turned office, spreadsheets covered an entire wall, as if each cell told a story of injustice. "I wish I'd started sooner," he said, adjusting his glasses. "But I had to see my sister forced to sell her house to understand the scale of the problem." The spreadsheets didn't lie. The numbers stood out like an open wound. Black, Latino, and new residents received 3 times more penalties than long-term white residents. And it wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. The infractions were absurd: a holiday wreath out of season, an unauthorized shade of blue on a door, a child playing with a ball on the lawn, small administrative aggressions that, together, built an invisible wall of exclusion. "This is social engineering," Clarence said, pointing to a bar graph. "They push you out without getting their hands dirty, and when you sell the house, guess who buys it?" He clicked the mouse and revealed another spreadsheet. Homes sold after years of heavy fines, stripped of market value, were acquired by shell companies, LLCs with different names, but all registered to the same address, the office of Langston Properties. There were over a dozen properties bought this way: a perfect cycle: oppress, devalue, acquire, renovate, resell for profit, and all under the veil of legality. Deborah had built an empire on suffering and silence, and no one had ever done anything because it all seemed technical until now. Because now it had a face, mine and Nyla's. I looked at the data and felt a mix of outrage and responsibility. This went far beyond me. It was a portrait of a system that expelled people quietly, without headlines, without scandals. A lake wasn't just water. It was the symbol of what they tried to take from us in silence: peace, belonging, dignity. And it was clear that Deborah wasn't just an authoritarian HOA president. She was the architect of a sophisticated exclusion machine. Clarence handed me an old leather folder. Inside were copies of property records, leaked emails, HOA meeting histories, and documents linking Deborah to every company involved in the transactions. "It's not just statistics," he said. "It's the story of people being torn from their homes. Now it's up to you to decide what to do with it." I closed the folder firmly, and I decided I wouldn't wait for Deborah to make her next move. In that moment, I realized she wasn't just trying to expel a grieving man and his daughter. She was perpetuating a cruel cycle of power, cloaked in cold laws and bureaucratic meetings. But while she counted on fear, I now had data, allies, and the truth. And truth, when wielded well, is the kind of weapon that leaves no trace, but makes an impact. And this was just the beginning. From the start, my life had always been about numbers, risks, and strategies. But in that moment, faced with what we uncovered, I understood I was dealing with more than a simple transaction. It was a silent war for territory, for belonging. I created a company called Whitaker Holdings, LLC, using an out-of-state address and nominal partners so no one could tie it to me. I couldn't risk Deborah catching wind of my moves too soon. The plan was simple but required surgical precision. I reached out directly to Summit Vista Development, the original developer that owned the lake. The company had been financially strained since the pandemic and needed liquidity urgently. I offered $360,000 in cash, a figure higher than what Deborah had been trying to cobble together with deferred promises and uncertain investors. The proposal was accepted quietly. No fanfare, no public meetings, no time for reactions, and the contract was ready to be signed in less than a week. Meanwhile, the HOA president continued her performance. She organized special meetings, launched campaigns for lake heritage preservation, and pressured residents to approve an emergency acquisition fund. She portrayed herself as a savior, asking for $50 monthly contributions per household. But every cent of that fund had another destination: to finance her personal project of turning the lake into a restricted luxury space, managed by Langston Properties. The irony? She was raising funds to buy something that was already sold, to me. While she delivered fiery speeches about unity and community legacy, she had no idea the contract was already in my drawer. Silence was the key to the strategy. I needed her to believe she was winning. The more she committed publicly, the harder her fall would be. During those days, I feigned normalcy. I started taking afternoon walks with Nyla, smiling at neighbors. I attended HOA meetings with a neutral demeanor, as if I were just trying to fit in. But inside, the plan was growing like a marching army. Clarence and Royce reviewed clauses, pointed out legal weaknesses, and studied the limits of the HOA's authority. This was more than a revenge scheme. It was a liberation movement. While Deborah schemed, I strengthened alliances. Royce arranged coffee meetups with old HOA adversaries. Clarence organized the documents with the meticulousness of an accountant. The group grew quietly but with conviction. It was like a revolution whispering through hedges and concrete walls. Everyone knew, when the time came, there'd be no turning back. And that time was near. The contract would be signed in 72 hours. The lake, with its 6 serene acres, its shores reflecting the sunset, its memories of Lena, would be in my name, though no one would know. And from there, every move Deborah made would be a dance on ground that no longer belonged to her. I just had to wait and keep a calm face until the reveal. It didn't take long for the retaliation to start. A notice arrived for leaving a rug on the porch, something that had been there since we moved in. Days later, another fine, this time for an unauthorized plant Nyla had been lovingly tending. A week later, the absurdity, a violation for storing an inflatable kayak in the backyard. The HOA was suffocating us with bureaucracy disguised as order. But that wasn't all. They started taking pictures of us, sometimes from a distance, sometimes blatantly from the sidewalk. Men and women with clipboards pretended to conduct inspections, but the focus was always our house. My daughter, who had been oblivious to adult politics until then, started coming home from school withdrawn, her head down. "Dad, Why do the kids call me the neighborhood problem? She asked, her eyes welling with tears. The children of HOA members were repeating what they heard at home. Nyla became the target of jokes and exclusion. They say we're going to ruin everything, that you want to destroy the community, she told me, crying as she clutched her fishing rod. It tore something inside me. This wasn't just about me or Deborah anymore. It was personal. They were hurting my daughter to drive us out through exhaustion. I knew what they were doing. Royce had warned me. This is her tactic. Small fines, public embarrassment, emotional pressure, until you sell the house. But I wasn't going anywhere. And the more fines came, the more residents quietly knocked on my door. Some wanted to know how to resist. Others just needed to vent. They all had similar stories. A widowed woman had been fined for planting daisies in her front yard. A gay couple was reported for using inappropriate Christmas lights. A war veteran with mobility issues got a citation for leaving his cane leaning on the outdoor railing. The HOA's mask was slipping, and behind it was something more sinister than any regulation. That's when we formed a group. Nothing formal, just text exchanges, discreet meetings, knowing glances at the local market. But there was the seed of real resistance. Deborah thought she was winning, but without realizing it, she had lit a fuse she could no longer control. Every fine, every humiliation, every abuse only increased the number of people ready to fight back. And amidst it all, I kept smiling in the hallways of HOA meetings. I kept waving to neighbors, taking Nyla fishing at the hidden creek in the woods nearby, because I knew something she didn't. When the truth came out, there'd be no putting out the fire. The community was waking up, and nothing could stop what was coming next. It all started as a whisper, a quick conversation in the public library with an older man who said he was tired of swallowing it quietly. Then, an informal invite for coffee in the basement of a local bakery. Within 2 weeks, the secret meetings multiplied. Gatherings sprang up in garages, back rooms, locked spaces. Resistance was being born, with strength, names, and stories. On one of those nights, a single mother named Renee shared that she'd been barred from entering the community pool with her kids for being dressed inappropriately. She was wearing a regular swimsuit and a cover-up. The HOA's excuse? Visual Conduct Code. Another story came from Walter, a war veteran with limited mobility, whose accessibility ramp was labeled an obstructing visual. It took 3 citations before he was heard. Serena Dash, a florist who ran a small shop near the community center, revealed she'd received a direct warning from Deborah. It'd be a shame if your commercial lease renewal wasn't approved, the president had said after Serena questioned an extra fee imposed on small businesses. It was veiled blackmail, but cruel. Most had experienced something similar and stayed silent. But now, no one wanted to stay silent anymore. The stories piled up like dry kindling, ready to ignite. Even the most cautious began to take a stand. A new feeling was brewing in Willow Glen, organized fury. Each shared story added more outrage, more purpose, and the more Deborah empowered herself, the deeper she dug her own grave. Our group grew discreetly but with a solid foundation. We created an encrypted messaging network. Each member shared evidence, photos of citations, recordings of conversations, copies of ignored bylaws. It wasn't just venting, it was preparation. We were gathering proof for something bigger, and with every meeting, our conviction grew. She would fall. We decided together to wait for the right moment. Let her expose herself. Let her speak, promise, smile. We wanted her center stage, surrounded by spotlights and fake applause. Only then, with everyone watching, would we pull the rug out from under her. Deborah Langston's fall wouldn't be quiet. It would happen in front of the entire community, and it would be impossible to ignore what came next. In the quiet of a Tuesday morning, I got the call. The deed transfer was officially complete. With a signature and a direct deposit of $360,000, the Willow Glen Lake, 6 acres of crystal clear water and tree-lined shores, now belonged to Whitaker Holdings, to me, indirectly. There were no fireworks, no public announcements, just a strategic, cold, calculated silence. I locked the contract in a safe and went about my day as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Deborah was finalizing preparations for her big presentation at the next HOA meeting. She hired a well-known architect from the neighboring city, printed posters, and designed a project that included building a private lounge by the lake. The goal? To sell exclusivity, to charge for what should belong to everyone. While she spoke of property value enhancement, I was consulting my environmental lawyers. We had discovered that the contract between Summit Vista and the HOA could be terminated early if there was environmental negligence, and there was. Improperly used chemicals, lack of oversight, gradual pollution ignored. We had technical documentation, photos, and reports. The legal grounds to break the contract were ready. I scheduled a private meeting with the lawyer, the local cop Rick Collins, an old friend of Royce's, and Clarence. We went over Deborah's presentation line by line and crafted a meticulous plan to interrupt the event at the exact moment. The reveal couldn't be too early or too late. The perfect timing would be when she was at the peak of her performance. With everyone watching, captivated by the false shine, Royce suggested we wait until she announced the special fee, $65 per month per family, for 18 months to cover the construction costs. The scandal would be bigger. Deborah would talk about prosperity, unity, progress, and then I'd step in with the document in hand. The idea was for the community itself to realize how much they'd been manipulated, and that the loss of the lake wouldn't come from me, but from her greed. In the days leading up to the meeting, I felt the tension rise. The neighborhood was buzzing with excitement about the event. Some spoke of the new dock as if it already existed. Others asked about the lake changes as if they'd been consulted. No one knew it was all a mirage created by Deborah to attract money and cover her financial ruin. But soon the fog would lift. On the day of the event, the sun seemed to mock the occasion. Clear skies, HOA flags fluttering in the breeze, and the plastic smiles of Deborah's allies filling the room. Clarence looked at me and said, "Today, she trips over her own heels." I just nodded. Everything was ready. The trap had been set with surgical precision, and it would only take one misstep, one single misstep, for her to fall right into the center of the stage. The community hall was decorated like it was a groundbreaking ceremony. Blue balloons, a table with fine cheeses, crystal glasses gleaming under the natural light streaming in from the lake. Deborah wore white, as if she were marrying her own project. She stepped onto the podium with the posture of someone who had already won. The community applauded, unaware that the fantasy she was about to sell was on borrowed time. The presentation began with inspiring words, old photos of the lake, and promises of a new era for Willow Glen. Deborah spoke enthusiastically about an exclusive lounge, a floating deck, and even a seasonal bar service. At the end of the promotional video, timid applause spread. Then she announced the proposal for an extra $65 monthly fee. That was the moment we'd been waiting for. Time to lift the veil. I stood up slowly, walking toward the stage with a brown envelope in my hands. No one understood until I took the microphone. "Good afternoon, neighbors. My name is Darren Whitaker, and as of this moment, the HOA's use of this lake is officially terminated." The room froze. Deborah, still holding her microphone, laughed nervously. "Is this a joke?" I just showed the documents. I pulled the deed from the envelope and held it up for the audience. This lake legally belongs to Whitaker Holdings LLC, and the usage contract with the HOA was terminated last night due to environmental clause violations. Deborah tried to grab my arm, whispering, "You can't do this." I just replied, "I already did," and I pointed to the cop at the back of the room. Rick walked forward with calm but firm steps. "We request, based on the new ownership, that everyone vacate the lake area within 15 minutes, Rick said loudly. The silence was deafening. Guests exchanged glances. A woman let her glass slip from her hand. Deborah took a step back, at a loss for words. What she had treated as her private property was now, in fact, private, but not hers. The audience, in disbelief, began to understand. Some residents started to stand and leave quietly. Others approached me to read the documents. "So all of that was a lie?" a middle-aged man murmured, looking at Deborah. She tried to rally. "The community won't accept this," but her voice no longer carried authority. It was just noise. For the first time, she was on shaky ground and without visible allies. Outside, Serena Dash was filming everything on her phone. Other residents started taking pictures. Deborah tried to convince them it was a legal misunderstanding, but no one was listening anymore. The spell had broken. Royce whispered in my ear, "She hasn't realized yet, but she just lost the narrative. And for someone like her, that's a slow death." I just watched. Everything was unfolding as planned. Deborah, frozen on the stage, saw her empire crumble right there, under the light of the lake that no longer belonged to her. And as the room emptied, the gleam in her eyes faded too. I didn't need to shout or threaten. The truth, raw and cold as the lake water that morning, was enough, and what came next would be even more devastating. Deborah's first reaction was predictable, a lawsuit for damages to the community's reputation. She filed in the local court, wearing the same white blazer she used to command HOA meetings, but it took just one hearing for the judge to dismiss the case outright. My lawyer presented the lake deed and the legal termination documents for the shared usage. She lost the first of many battles there, and perhaps the last one she still believed she could control. Desperate, she tried to rally the HOA board again, but half the members had already resigned. Those who remained stayed quiet, distant, avoiding being tied to any new retaliation attempts. Deborah tried to manipulate the local press, claiming my authoritarian action was dividing Willow Glen. But now there was a wall of residents with their own voices she had tried to silence for years, now speaking for themselves and for each other. That's when she made her final mistake. In the dead of a quiet night, security cameras around the lake caught Deborah and two allies dumping liquids from dark bottles into the water. It was a pathetic attempt to fake pollution and bolster her narrative. The footage was immediately turned over to the police. Within 48 hours, she was arrested for environmental crimes and trespassing. The handcuffs on her wrists shone brighter than her old pearl necklaces. The arrest lit the fuse for a formal investigation. Prosecutors launched an audit of her management. They uncovered the scheme. Deborah used fines and psychological pressure to force home sales, which were then bought at rock-bottom prices by shell companies tied to her real estate firm. She wasn't just authoritarian. She was part of an immoral speculation racket. But that was just the tip of the iceberg, because something even bigger was about to happen. The week after Deborah's arrest, I called a community meeting. I made a point to invite all the residents, except the former HOA board members. The local school auditorium was packed, the seats filled with neighbors who, for the first time in years, were ready to listen and speak without fear. I stepped onto the stage with calm, but a firmness in my heart. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, but there was also hope in the eyes looking at me. I proposed the creation of an independent, transparent community fund to manage the lake. 3 non-negotiable conditions: a complete overhaul of the HOA with free elections and term limits, a full review of internal rules, and the establishment of an ethics committee with rotating resident participation. Murmurs of approval spread through the room. It was more than a proposal. It was a reclaiming of that place's dignity. For the first time, decisions would be made by everyone, not by a single imposing figure. And then I revealed my quietest, most powerful move. Over the past few months, with Clarence's banking contacts, I had acquired the mortgages of 18 homes, including Deborah's. A gasp swept through the room, followed by startled looks. But before fear could take hold, I clarified. It wasn't to take anything from anyone. It was to offer fair refinancing, free from the constraints Deborah had used to manipulate and punish. It was the start of a new Willow Glen, fairer, more united, and finally free. The lake now had a name, Lena's Lake. A hand-carved wooden sign was installed by the dock, with golden letters and flowers around it. Simple, but full of meaning. 3 months after Deborah's fall, I organized the first community fishing event. Families arrived with folding chairs, kids running with rods in hand, the aroma of homemade pies floating in the air. Nyla, in jeans and a blue t-shirt, taught the little ones how to release fish gently, just as her mom had taught her. The sunset painted the water orange and gold as everyone began to say their goodbyes. I stayed seated with Nyla on the old dock, our feet swinging over the calm water. She looked at the horizon and said, her eyes teary but smiling, "Mom would be proud, right?" I took a deep breath, feeling the air lighter than I had in a long time. She is, and not just of us, of this whole community that learned to resist and to start over. What's the most outrageous HOA fine you've ever heard of? Drop your comment. I really want to hear your story. And if you think this revenge was intense, you won't believe the HOA nightmare popping up on your screen right now. Check it out.